Rain tapped against the windshield of the black SUV, streaking long lines across the glass. Roman Vale killed the engine and stepped into the sharp smell of bleach and garbage that always hung around the service lot of Riverside Academy. He wasn't supposed to be here, his driver usually handled pickup, but a message had arrived on his phone that changed everything. Back lot. Alone. Now. He followed the instructions, pushed through a side door near the dumpsters, and froze. In the narrow mop closet, under the flicker of a failing light, his 10-year-old son was on his knees, sleeves rolled back, tiny hands submerged in gray water. His blazer, the one with the gold-stitched crest, was soaked and streaked with dirt. A slip of paper fluttered on the peeling wall above him, discipline, defiance. Roman's chest tightened. He had built companies worth billions, but he had never felt this powerless. His child was scrubbing floors like a criminal. Then Miles coughed. Harsh, ragged, the kind of sound that rips air from the lungs. Roman's eyes shot to the bucket. A half-crushed blue inhaler floated among the suds. The school had taken his lifeline and tossed it away. Roman moved instinctively, but another figure stepped forward first. In the corner stood Kofi Adeyemi, the custodian. Sleeves rolled, mop set aside, his broad frame blocking the doorway. His eyes met Roman's, not with shame, but with a quiet defiance. "Your boy tried to stop something," he said softly. "They punished him for it. I couldn't let him sit here alone." Roman's throat burned. He pulled Miles up, holding him close, while Kofi's steady gaze carved the truth deeper. This wasn't an accident. This was a system. They left the building in silence. Rain plastered Miles' hair to his forehead. Roman settled him into the SUV, pressed a spare inhaler into his palm, and watched the boy's chest rise and fall in halting breaths. Parents streamed past with umbrellas, chatting about weekend trips and recitals, unaware that just steps away a child had nearly suffocated in a mop closet. If you found your child hidden like this, punished for standing up when others turned away, would you keep silent? Subscribe now, and tell me where you're watching from. The front office smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. Roman slammed the slip marked "Defiance" onto the counter. The receptionist barely looked up. Discipline logs are on the board. On the corkboard hung dozens of red-inked slips. Miles' name glared back, Vale, Miles, Defiance. No notes, no nurse's record of an asthma attack. The dean arrived, smile practiced, tie perfectly straight. "Mr. Vale. Your son disrupted order. Vandalism in the north hallway. He'll serve character hours until we see improvement." Vandalism? Roman's voice cut through the room. "Cameras malfunctioned," the dean replied smoothly. "Unfortunate timing." Roman leaned in, his breath sharp. "You let a child suffocate because your cameras broke?" The smile never faltered. "Discipline builds men, Mr. Vale. Even yours." For the first time in years, Roman wanted to put his fist through glass. Later, outside the gates, Kofi pressed a battered notebook into his hand. Inside were rows of dates, initials, and duties scribbled in careful pen. A pattern unfolded. Every time a scholarship kid or staff kid clashed with a donor's child, the punishment was the same. Cleaning duty. Off the record. Roman flipped through the pages, stomach heavy. "Why show me this?" he asked. "Because your boy stood up for someone smaller," Kofi said. "That's his only crime." Roman saw it clearly now. His son hadn't defied authority. He had protected someone else. And the school had chosen to protect its donors instead. As the SUV rolled toward the city skyline, Roman's phone buzzed. An airdrop request. Anonymous. He accepted. The screen filled with shaky footage from a hallway. Miles, small but unyielding, stood in front of a boy half his size. Across from him loomed Sebastian Lorne, son of a trustee, fists clenched. Teachers walked past, eyes averted. Miles held his ground. The clip ended with the phone yanked away. Roman gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. His son hadn't been lying. He was guilty only of bravery, and bravery had no place in a school run by money. If proof like this disappeared in your city, would you let it slide? Subscribe now, and comment where you're watching from. The city's lights glittered across the river, cold and distant. Roman Vale had always believed his empire gave him control. Tonight, control was a ghost. In the back seat, Miles slept, blazer still damp, inhaler clutched in his fist. By the bus stop, Kofi stood alone in the rain, collar turned up, notebook under his arm. Roman saw him differently now, not a custodian, but a witness, maybe the only one brave enough to stand against the machine. Roman had come to pick up his son from school. Instead, he had walked straight into a truth he couldn't unsee. If this shook you, if you believe silence protects the wrong people, hit subscribe now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The wipers carved clean arcs across the windshield, but nothing cleared the film inside Roman's chest. Traffic slid along the FDR like a slow river of chrome. The city's lights were coming on, one floor at a time, as if Manhattan were reminding everyone it could glow without permission. In the back seat, Miles curled toward the door with the blanket pulled up to his chin, the inhaler resting in his small hand like proof the world could be cruel for no reason. Every few breaths, his shoulders rose a little too high and fell a little too fast. Roman took the next exit anyway, because the straightest line home sometimes isn't a rescue, it's just distance. The penthouse looked staged for another man's life. The elevator doors parted to the hush of engineered air, art that cost as much as buildings, and a view that behaved for no one. He set his keys down and listened to the apartment's practiced silence swallow the sound. Miles didn't ask for dinner. He asked for paper. Roman brought the thick sketch pad from the study and a handful of pencils a designer had left behind last week. The boy cleared a space on the coffee table with his forearm and began drawing hard, fast marks that didn't pretend to be mountains or spaceships. Boxes. A dark rectangle with a smaller square near the top. The square had a round dot inside, like an eye that blinked only when it hurt. Roman watched from the kitchen island and felt a stupid wave of gratitude for the ordinary act of boiling water. He set tea on a tray he never used and carried it to the coffee table, and there was his son, absolutely, and still he felt like a guest in his own home. Miles didn't notice the cup. He was shading the corners of a closet so aggressively the paper buckled. On the counter near the sink lay Kofi's notebook, flattened open to a page of tight dates and initials. Roman had the thought men like him avoid because it rearranges the furniture in your mind. There were corridors in this city where his money didn't walk. The entries read like a calendar designed by someone who hates children: cleaning. 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 A note in the margin: nurse not called. No log. The handwriting stayed calm even when the facts weren't. Whoever wrote it had learned to be precise when the world refused to be. The phone on the island buzzed. A swirl of unknown numbers, unanswered calls, and a new message lighting the screen with a headline from a gossip site faster than the newspapers: Vale heir at center of disciplinary probe. Anonymous sources claimed vandalism. Behavior concerns. Roman breathed through it and watched Miles press pencil until the tip snapped. The boy rolled another from the pile without looking and kept going. The broken one lay on the floor like a cigarette he didn't know he dropped. At Riverside Academy, under glass trophies and banners announcing college acceptances like medals from someone else's war, a closed door muffled expensive voices. The boardroom's projector threw shaky hallway footage against walnut paneling, Miles with his arms out, a smaller kid behind him clutching a backpack like armor, Sebastian Lorne's jaw tilted higher than his age earned. A trustee's laugh cut the room. "Boys," he said, as if the word cancelled harm. Another trustee held up a palm: "Keep the tone." The head of school called it an internal matter, the kind of phrase that wipes prints from glass. No one said asthma. No one said mop water. They said brand. They said community confidence. They said the word discretion like it was a bandage. Roman stood in his own office at Vale Technologies 15 hours later with his sleeves still damp from a walk that had turned into thinking. Screens glowed along one wall, the city mirrored in their black before the images appeared, and he felt the difference between owning a skyline and being able to touch anything. His executive team gathered in a half-circle that understood him as balance sheets and growth curves, not as a father who had failed to arrive in time. He didn't give them a speech. He tapped the video and let the sound of a boy's breathing fill a room built for forecasts. "We're not selling anything today," he said when the clip ended. "We're learning how to listen." No one moved. It was the strangest meeting of their careers. He sent half the room to public records and the rest to the quiet corners of the internet where truth often hides because it has nowhere else to go. In an hour they returned with a map of incidents parents had posted, deleted, reposted, and given up on. A nurse who lasted 3 months and then resigned. A guidance counselor's email that talked about character hour, in language polite enough to make cruelty look like a curriculum. Roman circled dates that matched Kofi's ledger and felt the pattern hum like electricity behind drywall. It wasn't a mistake. It was a practice. At school drop-off the next morning, the lot ran like clockwork. Security nodded. Drivers idled. An assistant head smile stayed glossy in the wet light. No one could smell smoke because they had built their lives inside the fire and called it weather. Roman didn't go to the front desk. He took the service corridor that still wore the damp smell of bleach, and Kofi was there, stacking bottles with their labels turned out like soldiers at inspection. He didn't look up when Roman entered. He kept stacking until the line was straight, then wiped his hands on a towel that had seen everything. "They'll try to bend your boy's story until it breaks," Kofi said, not as a greeting, not as a guess. "Happens fast. Then the people who wanted to believe it already will." Roman asked how long the notebook had been kept. "Long enough," Kofi said. "I write when it happens. So I can't be told I imagined it." He said the words softly, like someone who knew volume didn't change a fact's weight. Roman felt the heat in his face. He recognized as old shame dressed in a new suit. The custodian had carried a record of harm for years because people with money refused to carry anything uncomfortable. He wanted to thank the man. He wanted to apologize to him. He settled on, "I'm not walking away." Kofi's eyes held his a second longer than comfort allowed. "They expect you will," he said. The first retaliation arrived at lunchtime as if scheduled. A finance blog ran a piece about restless investors and governance concerns at Vale Technologies, citing unnamed sources who had been sleeping fine yesterday. A parenting forum posted an anonymous message claiming Miles had a history. A PTA email went out with the strained brightness of people trying to keep the peace while a grenade rolls under the table. "Let's all remember our values." In a private thread Roman wasn't supposed to see, a trustee's spouse wrote, "So sad, but this is what happens when staff kids and scholarships get too comfortable." The sentence had the clean edge of a blade that cut from habit. At home, the elevator opened to the smell of pancakes because Roman couldn't think of anything else to cook that sounded like control. He cracked eggs with the careful violence of people trying not to shake. Miles set the table without being asked and arranged the plates in an order he'd never learned because no one had taught him how to be served. When they sat, the boy ate with quick little bites, then pushed the plate away and slid his sketchbook across the table. He had drawn the mop closet again, but this time there were 2 figures. A tall one near the doorway. A man with broad shoulders and tired eyes, a mop leaning against his leg like a spear. Kofi had been given space on the paper that Roman had not. Roman touched the page lightly, the way you touch something breakable that has survived anyway. "He helped you," he said. Miles nodded. The sound he made wasn't a word. It was agreement. Roman's phone buzzed and he didn't look, he let the world wait. They finished the pancakes and sat in the quiet that comes when a child is safe enough to be bored. Roman remembered the small boy in the video behind Miles, the one whose name he didn't know, and felt the shame again, He had built systems to measure everything except the only things that matter when a hallway decides to become a courtroom. He went back to the office with the drawing folded into his jacket. He asked legal about private school oversight and discovered a gap large enough to swallow a city block. He asked his head of security about the board members by name and learned how quickly expensive men call in favors when their children are involved. By late afternoon he had a list of the donors who held the school like a leash. At the top, the Lorne family, who purchased their sons' consequences the same way they purchased their art, quietly, strategically, and from a catalog that never shipped to the public. An email arrived with a tone that tried to sound neighborly and only managed to sound expensive. The Lorne firm invited Roman to a resolution. A donation in his son's honor, a statement about misunderstanding, a photo with the head of school. He looked out at the skyline and saw it for what it had always been, beautiful, complicated, and built on arrangements made in rooms like the one he stood in. He closed the email without replying. Evening brought rain again, finer this time, a mist that pricked the skin. Roman walked to a diner on Lexington where the waitress topped off coffee without asking because she knew when a person needed the gesture more than the drink. Kofi sat in a corner booth with the notebook between his hands and the shoulders of a man who did not believe a meeting would change anything. They spoke like people who had decided on honesty because they were too tired for anything else. The smaller kid's name was Jaden. Scholarship. Good grades. Mother working nights. The record showed nothing and therefore meant nothing because records are only as truthful as the people who write them. Why risk your job? Roman asked. Kofi stared at the rain on the window until it became city instead of water. Because I clean the same floor every night, he said. I won't clean the same story forever. Roman paid for the coffee in cash and they shook hands in a way that used fingers and forearms both, a grip that says, tell the truth and I'll still be here when it hurts. On the walk back, Roman's phone pulsed with a steady beat of headlines that weren't news so much as warnings. He thought of Miles asleep on the couch, one arm flung over his face like he'd decided he could block out the ceiling. He thought of a nurse's log that contained fewer words than a bandage. He thought of the men in the boardroom who had learned to point at numbers on a wall until every problem looked like a chart. If the place that promises to protect your child chooses its image over their breath, would you still wait for permission to speak? Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. At Riverside, lights turned off classroom by classroom until the building looked like a chessboard halfway through a game no one would admit they were losing. In the head of school's office, a folder slid into a drawer that didn't lock right. A line on the cover read, Character Hours. The capital letters tried to look upright. The paper inside listed names and dates and tasks that smelled like bleach. A teacher held the corner of the folder a second longer than she meant to, then walked away and pretended not to hear the drawer close. The next morning, Roman woke before the sun and stood at the window while the city assembled itself. Trucks made their first deliveries. A bus coughed and then forgave itself. A man with a dog nodded at a woman with a coffee, and this time they didn't pretend to be strangers. Miles slept on the couch again by choice. The inhaler rested on the table like a tiny blue promise. Roman tucked a blanket around the boy and left the room with steps that sounded like decisions. He had thought yesterday was the worst of it. He understood now it had only been the introduction. There were parents to speak to without being bought. There were staff to protect long enough for them to remember courage. There were reporters who still believed their job was to break what needed breaking. There was a board that needed to learn the difference between a school and a brand. He took the stairs instead of the elevator and felt the burn in his legs like punishment he hadn't earned but maybe deserved. On the first landing, his phone lit with a new message. A parent he didn't know had forwarded a photo of a white binder with a bent corner and a label typed too neatly, Character Hours. Roman smiled without humor. Paper always leaves a trail. People just pretend not to see it. He texted Kofi one sentence, we're not going to let this get erased. The reply came back fast, it never should have been written. Roman slid the phone into his pocket, stepped into the morning, and let the door swing shut on a version of himself he no longer wanted. Traffic honked. Pigeons lifted and settled again. Somewhere south, a school's custodial closet waited to be used for what a closet is for. He picked up his pace. If you've ever promised yourself you wouldn't look away next time, this is next time. Subscribe now, and tell me where you're watching from, so I know who's standing in this with us. The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Riverside Academy smelled faintly of waxed wood and expensive cigars, even though no smoke lingered in the air. The long glass table reflected the chandelier's glare, casting fractured light across the trustees' faces. It was here the real business of the school was done, not in classrooms, not in hallways, but in quiet chambers where reputation and power were currency. Roman Vale stood at the far end, his tailored suit sharp as a blade against the smug composure of the men and women who had gathered to silence him. He had been summoned under the guise of discussion. In reality, this was trial. His son, Miles, had been reduced to a disciplinary case file, stripped of humanity, summarized in terse sentences meant to justify the punishment Roman had witnessed with his own eyes. The file was neatly stacked in front of Mrs. Greeley, the board chair, her jeweled fingers tapping the cover as though the weight of the Academy's prestige sat inside. Roman's voice cut through the silence. This file leaves out the part where my son couldn't breathe. The trustees shifted but did not flinch. They had been here before, countless times, facing parents with less power, less money, less voice. They leaned back in their leather chairs, secure in the belief that no storm could breach these walls. Mrs. Greeley smiled thinly. Mr. Vale, we all sympathize. Children sometimes exaggerate, and discipline is never pleasant to observe. But our methods are tried and true. Roman placed both hands on the table. An asthmatic attack isn't exaggeration. Scrubbing floors in a locked closet isn't character building. That's cruelty. And it won't be buried under polished words. The word buried unsettled them more than the accusation. Because burying was exactly what they did, files tucked away, complaints neutralized, families persuaded to keep silent. But this time the father across the table was not some anonymous accountant or nurse. He was Roman Vale, a billionaire whose face graced magazines, whose fortune could dwarf their endowment if turned against them. The first fissure in their composure appeared when one trustee muttered, "Perhaps we could revisit the procedure." But Mrs. Greeley silenced him with a glare. "Mr. Vale," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "our school thrives because families like yours trust us. If you continue to cast shadows on our name, you jeopardize not only your son's place here but the future of many. Is that really what you want?" Roman studied the faces around the table. He saw it now, not guardians of education but custodians of an image, terrified of scandal, desperate to protect donors and legacy. Miles wasn't the first child sacrificed for reputation. And unless he fought, he wouldn't be the last. The glass table between them felt like a barrier and a mirror. Roman saw himself reflected, and behind him, the vague outline of the city skyline through the tall windows. A fortress of wealth, shielding its sins from the world outside. He leaned forward. "You want me to stay quiet. You want me to nod, smile, and accept this. That's how you've survived. But I'm not here to protect your institution. I'm here to protect my son." The trustees stiffened, their silence heavier than denial. One of them whispered something about legal action. Another shuffled papers. Mrs. Greeley kept smiling. That smile was worse than open hostility. It was the smile of someone convinced that wealth alone could be absorbed into their machine, neutralized, bought. Roman felt his chest tighten with rage. He wanted to shout, to overturn the polished table, to drag Miles into the room and force them to look at him, not as a statistic, but as a boy gasping for air on a dirty floor. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He pulled out his phone, unlocked the screen, and slid it across the glass. On it was the video. Grainy, shot in secret, passed to him by Kofi, the custodian who had seen too much. It showed Miles slumped against a bucket, struggling for breath, while a teacher's voice ordered him to continue. Roman didn't need to say anything. The footage spoke louder than any argument. The trustees froze. For once, their polished armor cracked. A woman's hand went to her mouth. A man muttered a curse under his breath. The image on that small screen was everything they had built walls to keep hidden. Mrs. Greeley's fingers trembled against her jeweled rings. Then her mask returned. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. Roman said nothing. Silence was power now, and he wielded it the way they had wielded it against countless families before. The board erupted in whispers. Strategies, threats, panicked calculations. Some urged immediate damage control. Others hissed about lawsuits, leaks, reputations destroyed. Roman let them squirm. Let them feel, for once, the fear they had inflicted on others. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "This is the truth. You can choose to face it now, or you can try to bury it. But if you bury it, I promise you, I'll dig until the whole world sees what you've done." The weight of his words hung over the table like a blade. If you've ever watched powerful people protect themselves while children suffer in silence, you know the rage that's building in Roman right now. Don't let silence win. Subscribe now so stories like this are never buried again. Silence followed. Not the kind of silence the Academy had relied on, but the silence of predators realizing the hunter had entered their cage. The board tried one last tactic. They offered Roman a compromise: Miles's record erased, privileges restored, even a scholarship named in his honor. All he had to do was keep the footage locked away. Roman felt the pull of temptation. The easy road. Protect Miles now, let others fend for themselves. But then he remembered the drawings on his penthouse wall, the sketches of a boy who saw more than his father ever realized. A boy who had trusted his father to fight. "No deals," Roman said. "You don't get to trade silence for favors anymore." The trustees recoiled as if struck. They were used to bargaining with frightened parents, not with a man willing to burn down the institution they worshipped. Mrs. Greeley's voice cracked like a whip. "Then you'll regret this, Mr. Vale. We'll ensure your son is seen for what he is: unstable, disruptive, a liability." Roman's jaw tightened. They weren't just threatening Miles's education. They were threatening his very identity. To label a child broken was worse than punishment, it was erasure. He stepped back from the table, collected his phone, and looked each of them in the eye. "The only unstable thing here," he said, "is the ground you're standing on." As he walked out, the weight of their glares followed him, but so did something else: fear. Real, palpable fear. Outside the boardroom, the corridors of Riverside Academy buzzed with the laughter of children who had no idea of the war being waged in their name. Roman paused, listening. Those voices were what mattered. Not the voices of trustees in silk suits, but the voices of children who deserved better. If you've ever seen a system turn its back on the innocent, you know what silence costs. Don't turn away, subscribe now, and stay with this story until the end. Roman's steps echoed on the marble floor as he left the building. He wasn't leaving defeated. He was leaving armed, with truth, with purpose, and with a fire the board could no longer contain. But he also knew this was only the beginning. The board had resources, connections, allies in high places. They would not surrender easily. And Roman Vale, billionaire or not, had just declared war on an institution that had survived generations by crushing men like him. Yet for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt the weight of every silenced parent, every unseen child, pressing against his back, urging him forward. The glass fortress of Riverside Academy had cracked. Now it was only a matter of time before it shattered. The chandeliers of the Astoria Grand dripped with light, 1,000 crystals scattering brightness over tuxedos and gowns. Outside, photographers' flashes lit the night like fireworks. Inside, donors and politicians sipped champagne, their laughter echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. This was the school board's fortress in public. No boardroom whispers tonight, only a staged spectacle of wealth and virtue. Roman Vale entered without hesitation. His presence drew eyes immediately. Billionaire, tech magnate, headliner of magazines, here he was, not as a sponsor, but as a storm. He hadn't been invited. He didn't need to be. Power opened doors, even when that power was about to be used against the people inside. The board had expected to control the narrative tonight. They had prepared speeches, polished talking points, and a carefully curated charity auction meant to showcase Riverside Academy as the crown jewel of education. But Roman's sudden arrival shifted the air. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused halfway to lips. At the center of the ballroom stood Mrs. Greeley, the board chair, in a shimmering silver gown. She was all smiles, shaking hands with a senator. But the smile slipped for half a second when she spotted Roman cutting across the marble floor. Roman didn't bother with pleasantries. He climbed the low stage where the podium stood, his polished shoes echoing on the wooden platform. The master of ceremonies tried to intercept him, whispering urgently, but Roman brushed him aside. The microphone was live. The gala hushed as though the chandeliers themselves had dimmed. "I won't take much of your time," Roman began, his voice calm but edged like steel. "You came here tonight to write checks. To support a school you believe represents excellence. But before you do, you need to know what you're really funding." The donors shifted uncomfortably. Cameras began to roll. Some guests thought this might be part of the evening's entertainment. Others knew better. Roman pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. With one tap, the screen behind the podium lit up, the massive projection intended for sponsor slides now playing the video he had carried from the boardroom. Miles, crumpled in the mop closet, gasping, the teacher's voice demanding obedience. The grainy image was damning in its simplicity. A murmur spread through the hall like a crack in glass. Guests leaned forward, horrified, while others looked to the board members scattered in the room for reassurance. Mrs. Greeley strode forward, her smile sharpened into a warning. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "Mr. Vale is misrepresenting an isolated incident." "The context." Roman's voice thundered over hers. "Context? The context is a child who couldn't breathe while adults looked the other way. The context is a board that tried to bury this footage, just as they've buried others. And the context is you, donors, funding their silence with your money." The tension was unbearable. Some guests set down their glasses, shame burning their faces. Others muttered angrily, unwilling to believe the polished school could be guilty of cruelty. Politicians in the crowd exchanged nervous glances, calculating the cost of their public ties to Riverside Academy. If you've ever witnessed truth being smothered by wealth, you know how heavy the silence can feel in this room. Don't let the silence win. Subscribe now and keep this fight alive. The video looped once more, each replay hammering nails into the board's carefully built image. A teacher dragging a boy to his feet. Miles clutching his chest. His small voice begging for air. The donors could not look away. Mrs. Greeley seized the microphone, her voice breaking. "This footage was obtained illegally. Mr. Vale is attempting to extort this institution with half-truths. Our staff are dedicated, our students thriving." Her words dissolved into the uproar. A senator demanded answers. A journalist, phone raised, live-streamed the chaos. Roman stood unmoving, a pillar in the storm. He didn't shout, didn't need to. The truth was louder than any speech. Security guards approached the stage, uncertain. They weren't sure if they were protecting the school from Roman or protecting Roman from the wrath of the board. Roman turned to the audience. "I came here tonight not to shame you, but to warn you. Your money is being used to polish glass walls while children suffocate behind them. If you want to write checks, know who you're writing them for. If you want to build legacies, know what you're building on, the silence of children, or the truth that could save them." A woman in the front row lowered her eyes. A man near the back muttered that his own nephew had complained about the school's discipline. Whispers grew into conversations, conversations into accusations. The board tried to rally, but the room was slipping from their grasp. Roman left the stage without looking back. He had detonated the gala. Whether the donors turned against the board or clung tighter to them, the illusion of untouchable prestige was gone. Outside, the night air hit his lungs like fire. Flashes burst around him, reporters shouting questions, cameras closing in. Roman didn't flinch. He walked straight through them, Miles's face etched in his mind, Kofi's warning echoing in his ears. This was no longer about a single child or a single school. This was about a system of glass walls and smoke-filled rooms, where children were expendable and image was sacred. Back inside, Mrs. Greeley steadied herself at the podium, demanding calm, promising investigations, dismissing Roman as a rogue parent blinded by wealth. But the cracks had spread too far. The donors had seen too much. Roman climbed into his car, slammed the door, and sat in silence. The gala noise still echoed in his ears, but beneath it was a deeper sound, the crumbling of walls that had stood for decades. He knew the board would retaliate. They would smear his name, target Miles, spin the footage as fabrication. They had resources, allies, and influence stretching into every corner of the city. But for the first time, Roman felt the tide shift. He wasn't alone anymore. The room full of donors had seen the truth with their own eyes, and some of them would not sleep easy tonight. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. This was war now, not a negotiation. And wars required endurance. The city lights blurred as he drove. Billboards glowed above the streets, selling luxury, success, prestige. Roman thought of Riverside's brochures, glossy promises masking rot. He thought of every child whose asthma attack, whose bruised knuckles, whose tears had been written off as character building. And he thought of Miles, sketching quietly in the penthouse, waiting for his father to prove he was more than a name on a magazine cover. Roman pressed harder on the accelerator. The fight had only begun. If you've ever wanted someone to stand against power when it crushes the innocent, you know what this moment means. Stay with this story, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The Astoria Grand shimmered behind him, its chandeliers still burning, but inside the glass fortress the smoke had begun to rise. The board would scramble, the donors would whisper, and the press would swarm. Roman had forced them into the open. For the first time, Riverside Academy's walls weren't hiding the children inside, they were hiding the fear of the people who built them. And fear, once exposed, could never again pretend to be strength. Roman Vale drove into the city night, the truth burning in his pocket, the battle roaring ahead. By dawn, the city's papers had already chosen their villain. Roman Vale's face stretched across the front pages, his jawline frozen mid-speech, his eyes caught in unflattering freeze frames. Headlines screamed of arrogance, recklessness, and a father blinded by wealth. Not one photo showed Miles. The boy was erased, his suffering reduced to a single line buried deep within the articles. The board had moved quickly, faster than Roman expected. They fed carefully edited clips to the press, footage of him storming the gala stage, his words cut mid-sentence, stripped of context. What had been righteous fury was reframed as an unhinged outburst. Anchors in polished studios shook their heads solemnly, lamenting how one man's ego threatened an entire institution's reputation. By noon, Roman's inbox flooded with messages from business partners, investors, old acquaintances. Some urged caution. Others distanced themselves, afraid of contamination by association. His phone buzzed with notifications, stock prices dipping, articles trending, hashtags spreading like wildfire. Hashtag unfit father, hashtag Vale meltdown, hashtag protect Riverside. The machine was in motion, and it was swallowing him whole. In the city's cafes, people argued over his name. Some admired his audacity, whispering that maybe he had shown them something real. Others repeated the board's narrative, dismissing him as another rich man picking a fight to inflate his ego. Truth had become a commodity, bought and sold by whoever shouted loudest. Roman sat in his penthouse office, the skyline stretching beyond the glass, watching his empire tremble. Miles sat at the corner table, crayons scratching nervously against paper, but the boy kept glancing up at the TV where his father's face flickered, framed by pundits' ridicule. Roman turned the screen off, unable to bear the reflection of lies. The phone rang. It was an old ally from the tech world, someone who once toasted Roman's successes with champagne. "You've got to think bigger picture," the voice said, careful and cold. "These things blow over, but only if you play along. Apologize. Donate. Distance yourself from the footage. It's not worth your fortune." Roman hung up without answering. Bigger picture. That was what the board had counted on, that he would value legacy and money over his son's dignity. That he would fold under pressure like so many before him. If you've ever seen lies shouted louder than truth, you know the silence it forces on the innocent. Don't let silence win. Subscribe now and carry this fight further. In the streets around Riverside Academy, posters went up overnight. Smiling children in neat uniforms, slogans about excellence and tradition, staged photos of teachers helping students with open books. But behind the posters, the whispers spread. Parents who once defended the school now looked at each other differently in drop-off lines. Some clutched their children's hands tighter. Others avoided Roman's gaze altogether. The board wasn't content with smears in the press. They reached deeper. Roman's foundation events began losing sponsors. Invitations dried up. Even charities he had funded issued carefully worded statements, eager to shield themselves from controversy. It was a surgical strike, not to kill his reputation outright, but to bleed him slowly, until he was too weak to fight. Roman refused to retreat. He turned instead to the people who mattered, the parents who had lived in silence. In quiet corners of the city, he met them. A mother whose son had been forced to run laps with a fever. A father whose daughter had been locked in a classroom until she confessed to something she hadn't done. Their stories poured out, hesitant at first, then desperate, like floodwaters breaking through a dam. He recorded their testimonies, not with slick production teams or staged backdrops, but on his phone, raw and unedited. Their faces bore the truth the board couldn't polish away, lines of exhaustion, eyes hollowed by fear. He knew these videos could be his counterattack, but he also knew releasing them would put these families at risk. The board's reach was long, their retaliation swift. Late one night, Roman sat at the dining table with Miles asleep on the couch nearby. He scrolled through the clips, each story heavier than the last. His finger hovered over the post button. One tap, and the world would see. One tap, and dozens of families might be dragged into the same storm already consuming him. If you've ever faced a choice between protecting yourself and speaking for those who can't, you know the weight on Roman's hand. Don't step away, subscribe now and walk with this story. Roman lowered the phone. Not yet. The timing had to be right. Too early, and the board would crush it with their machine. Too late, and the stories would vanish into silence. Outside his window, the city lights flickered. Somewhere below, the board's allies toasted their success, convinced they had cornered him. They didn't realize he was still gathering strength, still listening to the silence that hummed beneath the noise. The smear campaign had bruised him, yes. It had cost him friends, sponsors, and comfort. But it had also stripped away illusions. Roman now saw the board for what it was, not guardians of children, but architects of fear. And he saw himself more clearly too, not just a billionaire with a fortune to protect, but a father with a war to wage. As dawn broke again, Roman stood at the window, Miles stirring behind him. The city stretched endlessly, its towers gleaming. Somewhere in that sprawl, parents waited for someone to fight for them. Somewhere in those towers, the board sharpened their knives. Roman tightened his fists. The war was no longer about survival. It was about exposure. If they wanted to make him a villain, he would show them what a villain could do, with truth as his weapon. And for the first time, Roman smiled. It wasn't the smile of victory, not yet. It was the smile of a man who had stopped running from the fire and chosen to walk straight into it. The rain came down in sheets that morning, washing the city's streets in silver. Riverside Academy's banners sagged under the weight of water, their slogans blurred, their smiling faces distorted. Roman Vale drove through it all, his wipers beating a frantic rhythm, his jaw set hard against the storm inside and out. He had waited long enough. The testimonies sat on his phone, heavy as stone. Parents' voices trembling, eyes darting to unseen corners, stories whispered in living rooms that smelled of reheated dinners and exhaustion. He could hear them even now, echoing in his ears. A girl forced to kneel on a gym floor until her knees bled. A boy locked in a storage room for hours as punishment. None of it had reached the light. Until today. Roman didn't call the press. He didn't stage a conference. He went where truth couldn't be polished away, the community center in the Bronx, a place with peeling paint and flickering lights, where voices rose not from podiums but from the ground itself. Word had spread quietly. Parents trickled in, some clutching children's hands, others arriving alone, faces tight with fear but fueled by something stronger. Kofi was there too, standing near the back. His work shirt still smelled of bleach and dust, his eyes weary, but when he caught Roman's gaze, he nodded once. It was enough. Roman stood before them, not on a stage, but on the same level, his shoes squeaking against the damp linoleum floor. He held up his phone. "I'm not here to give you promises. I'm here to give you back your voices." One by one, he played the testimonies. The crackling sound of parents speaking their truths filled the room, a chorus of pain that no boardroom could erase. Faces bowed, hands covered mouths, tears slid down cheeks. Even the children listened, wide-eyed, hearing echoes of their own hidden scars. When the last clip ended, silence gripped the room. A silence not of fear, but of recognition. For the first time, they weren't alone. Roman broke it. "The board thinks they can smear me. They think if they destroy my name, yours will never be heard. But I didn't come here tonight to defend myself. I came to make sure your stories aren't buried. Together, we can make them listen." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. A mother spoke up, voice trembling but fierce. "If we speak, they'll punish our kids." "They already are," Roman replied. "The difference is, now the world will see it." He didn't promise safety. He didn't pretend the board wouldn't retaliate. He simply offered truth as a shield, raw and unpolished. If you've ever seen the powerful feed on silence, you know what's at stake in this room. Don't step away, subscribe now, and stay with this fight. By nightfall, the testimonies were live. Roman uploaded them without editing, each video stamped with date and time, each voice trembling but steady. He didn't attach a press release or a foundation logo. He let the parents stand as they were, unprotected but undeniable. The city awoke to them like a jolt of electricity. Feeds flooded with raw footage. Morning shows replayed shaky clips of fathers describing locked doors, mothers describing bruises. Hashtags flipped overnight, hashtag Protect Riverside began trending alongside hashtag Hear the Children. Roman's enemies still called him reckless, dangerous, unstable. But now, their words were drowned out by the voices of those who had lived the truth. In the board's glass tower, panic spread. Donors called in fury, demanding explanations. Teachers whispered in corners, afraid but emboldened. For the first time, cracks ran through their fortress that money couldn't patch. Roman watched it unfold from his apartment. Miles sat curled on the sofa, head resting against his father's arm, too tired to draw. On the TV, his father's name was still being dragged through mud, but beside it now were other names. Families whose stories made his own less lonely. Roman muted the screen and stared at his son. "They'll come harder now," he murmured, more to himself than to Miles. "But they can't bury all of us." He was right. By evening, the community center was overflowing. Families who had once whispered in fear now spoke in full sentences, louder, stronger. Journalists began showing up, notebooks open, cameras rolling. Roman didn't push himself to the front. He stayed among them, listening, letting their stories carry the weight. That was when he realized something crucial: this fight was no longer about him. His fortune, his reputation, his name, they were tools, yes, but they weren't the story. The story was in the mothers clutching children close, the fathers raising shaking hands, the janitor who risked his job for a boy he barely knew. Roman had lit the match, but the fire belonged to them. If you've ever wondered whether one voice can break the silence, you're seeing it happen now. Don't let the fire die. Subscribe now and follow this story to the end. Late that night, as the city hummed with this new storm, Roman stood on his balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick with reflections. He could see Riverside's banners in the distance, still hanging, still defiant, but now sagging under a weight they could no longer shake off. Miles came up beside him, holding a crumpled sketch. It was of the community center, crowded with people, voices drawn as jagged lines rising like flames. Roman looked at it and felt something in his chest unclench. For the first time, his son wasn't sketching alone figures or locked doors. He was sketching a crowd, a movement, a future. Roman placed a hand on Miles's shoulder. "This isn't over," he said softly. "But we're not alone anymore." The boy nodded, eyes fixed on the glowing city. Behind the glass walls of Riverside, the board would regroup. They would summon lawyers, call in favors, unleash new weapons. Roman knew the storm would grow darker before it broke. But he also knew the silence they had built their fortress on was gone forever. And once silence is broken, it can never be rebuilt. The gymnasium of Riverside Academy had been transformed overnight into a stage of survival. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board sat in polished defiance, their expressions frozen masks under the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind them hung the school's banner, blue and white, proclaiming excellence, tradition, discipline. The words drooped on tired fabric, no longer a promise but a shield. Parents filled the room, their voices a low thunder of anticipation. Reporters packed the back wall, cameras perched on shoulders, microphones ready to slice the silence. At the center of it all sat Roman Vale, not in tailored armor of a gala or boardroom, but in a plain suit that carried the weight of every story he had collected. Beside him, Kofi folded his calloused hands, eyes steady. The board chair, Mrs. Greeley, cleared her throat. Her voice, amplified by the cheap sound system, cracked with rehearsed calm. "We welcome you to this open hearing. We recognize the concerns that have been raised and assure you that Riverside Academy is committed to transparency." Her words were swallowed by a ripple of laughter, bitter, tired, unwilling to be fooled again. Roman rose before she could continue. He didn't ask for the microphone. He didn't need permission. The room was his because truth had already claimed it. Transparency. His voice carried across the gym like a bell. "You mean the transparency of locking children behind doors until they collapse? Or the transparency of silencing parents who dared to speak?" He pulled his phone from his pocket, the same device that had become a weapon. On its screen glowed faces the board had tried to erase, parents trembling as they spoke, children's eyes haunted by memories too heavy for their age. The reporters leaned forward, lenses catching every frame as the testimonies replayed for all to see. A father in the front row clutched his daughter's shoulder. A mother pressed a tissue against her mouth. The gym fell into a silence thicker than stone. Mrs. Greeley snapped, "This is hearsay, unverified accounts. Mr. Vale seeks to tarnish an institution that has served this city for over a century." Roman's hand cut the air. "Institutions aren't sacred. Children are." The word struck like a hammer. For the first time, one of the board members flinched. If you've ever seen the powerful protect their image while children suffer, you know why this moment matters. Don't look away, subscribe now to keep this fight alive. Whispers surged through the crowd, no longer whispers but voices rising. Parents stood, one after another, no longer content to let their stories remain on Roman's phone. A mother shouted across the gym, her voice breaking, "My son was left outside in the snow as punishment." Another father raised his hand, "They told my boy to run laps until he vomited. And then they called it discipline." The board shifted uneasily. Their fortress of glass was cracking under the weight of living witnesses. A reporter shouted a question, "Mrs. Greeley, do you deny these accounts?" She straightened, voice sharpened. "These are isolated incidents, exaggerated by a man seeking attention. Mr. Vale is using you, using your pain, for his own agenda." The parents erupted. Shouts, tears, fists striking the air. The board's carefully staged hearing had become a trial, and they were the accused. Roman didn't move from his spot. He let the voices swell, a storm he had only opened the door for. When the uproar began to subside, he spoke again, quieter, but cutting deeper. "Do you hear them? This is what you tried to bury. These are not my words. They are theirs. And they don't need me to speak for them anymore." The cameras drank it all in. The city outside would see parents' faces, not Roman's wealth, not the board's slogans. If you believe silence should never shield abuse, you understand what's happening here. Subscribe now so this truth isn't buried again. For the first time all night, Mrs. Greeley faltered. Her polished smile quivered, her hands tightened on the microphone. The board had relied on silence, but silence had turned into noise too loud to contain. In the back of the gym, Miles watched from his seat beside a teacher who had dared to escort him in. His small hand clutched a sketchbook, but tonight he didn't draw. Tonight he watched his father stand taller than the banners, taller than the board's fortress of glass. The gym's air thickened with something irreversible. Parents shouting. Reporters filming. Children wide-eyed. A century-old institution trembling in the spotlight. Roman stepped down from the makeshift stage and joined the parents, his presence not above them but among them. He didn't need to lead anymore. The fire was theirs. The board remained frozen, their fortress crumbling, their legacy shaking on a foundation of broken promises. And as the night deepened, one truth settled over the gym like a final verdict: Riverside Academy's silence was over, and nothing could rebuild it. By dawn the city had become an amplifier. Riverside's banners still clung to the fences, but they no longer spoke for the school. They were drowned out by cardboard signs, marker-scrawled demands, and chants that carried down every block. Parents, students, neighbors, strangers who had only seen the videos online, they all converged outside the academy's iron gates. Cameras lined the sidewalks like vultures waiting for movement. Police formed barricades, their radios buzzing, eyes restless. Behind them, the glass facade of Riverside shimmered in the morning light, a fortress pretending it could withstand a siege of voices. Roman arrived without convoy, without guards. Just a plain sedan rolling to the curb, his son Miles in the back seat, silent but alert. The moment he stepped out, a wave of reporters crashed forward, microphones stabbing the air with questions. "Mr. Vale, are you leading this protest? Do you intend to sue the school? Are you endangering your son by bringing him here?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The crowd's chant swelled behind him, "Hear the children. Hear the children." Kofi was already there, standing at the front with other parents. His shirt was clean but worn, his presence steady as stone. When Roman reached him, they exchanged no words, only a nod, a pact forged in silence stronger than any contract. The board had promised an official statement at noon. Until then, they hid behind their walls, hoping the storm outside might exhaust itself. But the storm only grew. Students slipped out of classes and joined their parents. Neighbors brought water bottles, granola bars, blankets. What began as anger was hardening into something else, resolve. Roman stood among them, not above. Miles clung to his father's hand, eyes wide at the sea of faces. For the first time, he wasn't alone in his fear. At 11:30, the doors opened. A handful of board members emerged, flanked by security. Mrs. Greeley at the center, her pearl necklace gleaming in the weak sun. She raised her hand for silence, but the chants only swelled louder, rolling like thunder against the school's polished stone. Her voice cracked through the loudspeaker. Riverside Academy condemns the spread of misinformation. The crowd roared in fury. Parents shouted their children's names, each a scar in the school's record. Students raised signs, "We are not liars. Discipline is not abuse." Roman stepped forward. Cameras pivoted instantly, capturing him as he faced the board on the steps. "You can't bury the truth under press releases," he said, voice carrying without a microphone. "Every lie you speak makes the truth louder." The standoff froze the air. Police shifted nervously. Security tightened their grips. Mrs. Greeley's smile strained, but she pressed on. "This assembly is unauthorized. If you do not disperse, there will be consequences. If you've ever seen power threaten those who dare to speak, you know why this moment matters. Don't turn away, subscribe now to keep this truth alive." The crowd answered not with retreat but with song. A mother began humming softly, joined by another, until voices layered into a melody older than any institution. Students picked it up, parents followed, the tune rising into the morning air like a second heartbeat. Miles tugged his father's sleeve and whispered for the first time in hours. Roman bent close. The boy's voice was small but certain, "They can't stop it." Roman's throat tightened. He squeezed his son's hand and kept his eyes fixed on the board. Inside the glass walls, teachers and staff peered from windows, some with folded arms, others with tears glinting. They weren't chanting, but they weren't stopping it either. The fortress was cracking from both sides. Noon struck. The bells of Riverside chimed mechanically, out of rhythm with the crowd's song. Mrs. Greeley tried once more to speak, but the sound system sputtered, drowned by the human chorus swelling louder, higher, unstoppable. Roman didn't smile. This wasn't victory. It was only exposure. The real battle, the lawsuits, the political maneuvering, the retaliation, still lay ahead. But in this moment, the silence that had shielded Riverside for generations had shattered beyond repair. Reporters streamed footage live. Social media flooded with clips, hashtags igniting. Some celebrated Roman as a hero, others painted him as reckless, but no one could deny what the cameras showed, a community refusing to be silenced. As the board retreated inside, the crowd surged closer to the gates, pressing against police lines. Roman pulled Miles back, shielding him. Kofi laid a steady hand on his shoulder. "They'll try to break us harder now," he murmured. "I know," Roman replied. His eyes never left the glass facade, where reflections of the chanting crowd shimmered like fire. "But they'll have to face us in daylight. If you believe silence should never protect abuse, you understand what's at stake. Subscribe now so this fight cannot be erased." By late afternoon, the chant still carried, voices hoarse but unrelenting. The board's doors remained closed, their silence a confession louder than words. Roman knew the cameras would leave, the headlines would fade, but the parents would remain. The children would remain. He looked down at Miles, who had begun sketching on the back of a protest sign with a borrowed marker. Not cages this time, not locked doors. He was drawing people, rows of them, hands raised, voices bursting from their mouths like jagged rays. Roman's chest tightened. The fight was far from over, but the future his son sketched was no longer one of silence. As dusk fell, the crowd lit candles, tiny flames pushing back the shadows that crept over Riverside's walls. The board stayed hidden, but the city had seen enough. Roman Vale stood in the glow of those candles, his son's small hand in his, knowing that the next strike from the board would come soon, and it would be brutal. But tonight, for the first time, he wasn't standing alone. And with that, the chapter closed not in triumph, but in defiance, an open wound of a story, demanding to be carried forward.